Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. I'm Marianne Gomez-Horta with the Congressional Hispanic Leadership Institute. Thank you for joining us for this briefing on ensuring equitable access to the COVID-19 vaccine. At CHLI, we are dedicated to fostering a broad awareness of the diversity of thought, heritage, interests, and views of Americans of Hispanic and Portuguese descent. CHLI prepares, connects, and honors leaders through internships, scholarships, and conferences that involve public service, leadership development, business, and academic excellence. CHLI also connects through public service and business. We have briefings on the Hill, which is one of our virtual platforms now. We have breakfast forums with members of Congress, both who are on our leadership as board members and those who aren't. We have networking programs that we've also pivoted to incorporate into this virtual environment. And of course, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, we are now holding all of the forums, including our Global Leaders Internship Program through a virtual platform. I want to start first by thanking our sponsor, Pfizer. For the last few years, this fourth quarter has always been a joint effort with our partner, Pfizer, to discuss relevant, timely health discussions. It's always interesting to me how we never really plan ahead what the topic is going to be, yet it kind of seems to fall on our lap as we start to plan for this fourth quarter program. I also want to have a special shout out to the wonderful lady over here, Dr. Elena Rios, who just joined us as one of our other panelists, to the lady as well, Dr. Jewel Mullen and Dr. Dara Richardson-Huron. Thank you so much for being with us today. I very special, again, wasn't planned like this. We just happened to have more women on the panel today, just saying. Love to see you all here and with your input and your expertise, which is extremely valuable at this time. As we know in our communities of color, your voice is very important during this time. A little bit about this series. We have been holding these public policy briefings in Washington on a quarterly basis on a variety of topics in alignment with our key areas that provide relevant research, insights, and provide information primarily to the Hill staff and to the members of Congress as they're planning and looking for input on policy legislation that they're in the process of reviewing, and many times maybe in the process of also pushing forward. Today's format will be that we will have some remarks first by Dr. Dara Richardson-Huron of Pfizer, will be followed by remarks by Congresswoman Donna Shalala from Florida and Congresswoman Jennifer Gonzalez Colon from Puerto Rico, live from Puerto Rico. Then we will pivot to the actual panel discussion where we will have the opportunity for Elisa Ramirez, and I will formally introduce her during that segment to moderate this panel discussion. For our attendees, please note that we will have a Q&A discussion at the end of the panel. But if you have a particular question, go ahead and put the question as we're going through in the Q&A and not in the chat. This way, when we get to the Q&A section, we will have your information already there. And then hopefully you don't have to remember what you were thinking about asking. At the same time, please consider who you would like to have answer that particular question, if not for the whole group. Our moderator will facilitate that, and I will be her backup for that as well. So without further ado, before moving on to the rest of the program, let's kick this off with the conversation and remarks by Dr. Dara Richardson-Huron. Ma'am, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much. And let me say a huge thank you to you, Marianne, and the Congressional Hispanic Leadership Institute for organizing this very important discussion. I also want to thank Congresswoman Donna Shalala and Congresswoman Jennifer Gonzalez Colon for being with us today and for their remarks that they will provide later, highlighting the importance of our discussion today and how we move forward in addressing the healthcare needs of our nation, especially as it relates to COVID-19. I am a physician by training and an advocate by choice. I'm the Chief Patient Officer at Pfizer, and I've really focused my 25-plus-year career on figuring out ways to decrease the burden of disease and to connect with and be an advocate with and for patients, particularly those who all too often aren't afforded a seat at the table. And now in my role as Pfizer's Chief Patient Officer, I have the opportunity and, quite frankly, the responsibility of making patients our North Star, our focus, our partners in everything we do. And, let's face it, in order to eliminate health disparities and ensure that the medicines, the treatments, and the vaccines that we develop benefit all patients and achieve our mission to bring forth breakthroughs that change patients' lives, we have to have direct input and participation of patients from all walks of life. So as you may have seen in the headlines in the news, our company, Pfizer, is actively working to develop a safe and effective vaccine candidate for COVID-19, something that I'm sure we'll go into more detail on in the Q&A. But to lay the groundwork, let me provide a quick snapshot on what we've accomplished and where we are today. So in collaboration with BioNTech, which is our partner, Pfizer is working closely with regulatory authorities to develop, test, and manufacture a potential vaccine that, if authorized and approved, could be deployed at unprecedented speed to help prevent COVID-19. And I want to be very clear. We're moving fast, yes, but we are not cutting any corners. We are accelerating the vaccine development process by doing some of the operational steps in parallel rather than sequentially. And that greatly shortens the time frame. Vaccine safety remains our #1 priority. And we've publicly committed to work closely with clinical trial sites and experienced investigators and regulatory agencies worldwide to ensure high quality and safe standards and make sure that they are rigorously applied to our development program. And we're also leveraging our 100+ years of scientific expertise. We're not new to the vaccine game. We've pioneered vaccine discovery and development over the years, and we really are excited to have an opportunity to be part of responding to this global health crisis. And, we're acutely aware of the responsibility that rests on our shoulders and the lives that are at stake. I think just a few weeks ago, the world reached the very sobering milestone of 1 million deaths from COVID. And while this news is devastating on its own, we also know that this virus is not impacting all people equally. Vulnerable and underserved communities, including certain Latinx communities, face increased risks of contracting and suffering serious consequences as a result of COVID-19. Data show particularly large disparities in cases and deaths for Black and American Indian and Alaska Native people, and widespread disparities in cases among Hispanic people compared to their white counterparts. And a recent analysis from the Kaiser Family Foundation found that from March through mid-July, people of color were 5 times more likely to be hospitalized for COVID-19 than their white counterparts. It's not okay, right? And we're committed at Pfizer to addressing these unacceptable health disparities in underrepresented populations by increasing diversity of participation in the clinical trial process, because we know that race or ethnicity may affect how one's body responds to a particular medicine. Just a few steps we're taking to achieve a clinical trial diversity in our COVID-19 vaccine trial. First of all, many of our investigator sites are in diverse communities that have been disproportionately affected by COVID-19, so that individuals in those impacted communities have the opportunity to participate in our trial. We're also working with each site in an effort to recruit populations that fully represent the racial and ethnic diversity of their communities, and with advocacy partners to raise awareness about this trial and the importance of clinical trial participants in general. We're also working with advocacy organizations to raise awareness about the importance of participation as part of our broader work to address social determinants of health. And we have begun an integrated, targeted public relations and digital campaign, leveraging media and stakeholder engagement. Now, just last month, Pfizer and BioNTech expanded the enrollment of our trial to up to 44,000 participants. And this was to allow for enrollment of new and more diverse populations, including adolescents as young as 16 years of age and people with chronic stable HIV or human immunodeficiency virus and hepatitis C or B infections. And as of October 19th, I am so happy to report that 28% of our global participants and 13% of the US participants enrolled in our phase 3 trial are Latinx, are Hispanic. And all in all, approximately 43% of our global and 29% of our US participants have diverse backgrounds. And I want to highlight that these numbers are really good, much higher than the average minority participation rate in clinical trials. But we know our work is far from done. And we're keenly aware that much more work needs to be done to increase diversity in clinical trials. I'll talk a little bit about that later and hopefully in some of the questions. But we need to learn about and address disparities, improve access to high quality healthcare, and develop impactful strategies to minimize the social determinants of health as contributors to disease and chronic morbidity. And so I'm looking forward to today's conversation, both to share my perspectives and to learn from all of you, given the incredible expertise and wisdom we have on our panel today. So again, thank you for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I look forward to the conversation.
All right, thank you, Doctor. I really appreciate that. We're going to now have remarks by our members of Congress. First, live from Puerto Rico, Congresswoman Jennifer Gonzalez Colon. And I'm going to ask also if Dr. Ibarra, if you can also, we can see your video on. What I would like to do before the Congresswoman actually starts to make remarks is, this is your chance to smile in the camera so we can take a good photo that we can all share. I know my team is ready to take pictures. If you can please also make sure that we can see your name in the screenshots. And so when I say 3, everyone please smile into the camera, okay? You're ready? Okay, 1, 2, 3. All right, I know we got a good one in there somewhere. Just want to make sure we didn't have all our eyes closed. Muchísimas gracias. Thank you so much. Just want to let everyone know that Congresswoman Jennifer Gonzalez Colon is a member of the board of directors of CHLI. So she's one of my bosses. So, you know, bosses usually go first. So we want to make sure the floor is yours, Congresswoman. We'd love to hear your remarks and any other insights you would like to pose to the group, the panelists, or this conversation.
First of all, I want to say thank you. And I don't think nobody can be your boss, Marianne. I mean, you are a true leader in Chile, and of course, doing these kind of new gatherings that no longer are in the hill like we used to have it. So we are adapting to the new situation. So I want to say thank you to my great friend Lincoln Diaz-Baralt and you for this invitation and to participate in this today's briefing. And I was just hearing one of the panelists, and what a good time to have this kind of discussion. Having the opportunity to have my friend Congresswoman Donna Chalala as part of the panel, it is important for me. She's been a staunch supporter of the people living in Puerto Rico, and I treasure the bipartisan working relationship we have built in Congress in the last 2 years in many issues, not just healthcare, but including actually supporting manufacturing in the U.S. I also want to thank Pfizer, not just because you get 2 great panelists today, and everything you've been doing for the groundbreaking and unprecedented effort to spearhead and develop in record time a COVID-19 vaccine that should be effective, safe, and reliable and available for wide distribution before of the end of this year. But for many decades, Pfizer has been a key partner to the people of Puerto Rico, creating thousands of jobs and of manufacturing in the island, and there still does. And I think today's briefing cannot be overstated because as we get closer and closer to the rollout of the new vaccine, every effort that at the federal level in Congress and the private sector must be made, not just governmental, but companies like Pfizer, to ensure that such a vaccine could be accessible to everybody. And that's the reason of this panel. Back in August, President Trump announced the new framework, Operation Warp Speed, a national initiative to accelerate the development, manufacturing, and distribution of COVID-19 vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics. And among the key objectives of this program aims to have substantial quantities of a safe, effective vaccine available for all Americans beginning in January of next year. So to this date, Congress has directed almost $10 billion of dollars for this effort throughout supplemental funding, including the CARES Act, appropriations for flexible funding. Over $6.5 billion are being designated by Congress for countermeasure vaccines development through BARDA, the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority, along with another $3 billion for NIH research. And before these vaccines are approved or authorized, this operation will build the necessary plans for the infrastructure for distributing them, especially the unprecedented effort that will be necessary to deliver vaccines to hundreds of millions of Americans in the states and territories in a timely manner. This initiative should also expand the supplies of specialized materials and resources, such as cold chain storage, glass vials, and other materials that may be necessary for distribution as well. I think that once the product is ready, the Department of Defense involvement will enable faster distribution and administration that will have otherwise been possible using wholly private medical infrastructure. I think the early distribution of these vaccines will likely cover healthcare and other essential workers and those at the highest risk of severe illness. Puerto Rico territories, like many other states, has been hit hard by this pandemic, and combining that with the hurricanes that we're still recovering and the more recent earthquakes have resulted in a very challenging environment. I think the recent numbers show over 29,000 active cases of COVID-19 in Puerto Rico, with 768 reported deaths and 585 confirmed deaths. But Island is still contributing to share and secure expedite solution to the crisis. And just a few months ago, just to provide you an example, the local University of Puerto Rico, the School of Medicine, and the Ponce Health Science University, with a clinical research lab in the island, have joined forces to participate in clinical studies of vaccines that are going to be in the last phases in research in November in the island. So I think that getting this done and helping communities and Latinos and populations that may and should have access to these vaccines in a timely manner should be essential. And to implement that plan that ensure equitable allocation of initially limited vaccines until there is sufficient supply should be the #1 goal. So having CHLI providing this panel with such a great speakers, I think it will point out how important it is to work together to get it done, to get factors like population health disparities, individual with higher risk because of their occupation, their race, or living conditions, and geographic distribution of active virus spread must be assessed in making such determinations. So I'm happy to be here and to answer any question, but actually to hear our panelists in this matter.
Muchísimas gracias. Thank you again, Congresswoman. Greatly appreciate your remarks. And it's also extra important because you are representing Puerto Rico, that we make sure not only in this conversation, but moving forward, that we keep our brothers and sisters in Puerto Rico in mind as this moves forward. So thank you very much for the remarks. We are now going to move to Congresswoman Donna Shalala from Florida, who has provided us with a recorded message.
Sorry, I can't join you today, but I want to emphasize that the subject matter you're discussing, equitable access to COVID-19 vaccines, is absolutely critical, both for the drug companies to understand that we believe that no matter what your background, what your ethnicity, what your income level is, these vaccines ought to be distributed fairly. We do not want to increase the disparities among the Hispanic community or any other community. That's also a government responsibility. equitable distribution of the vaccines will reinforce the success of starving this COVID-19 virus. Sorry I can't be with you, but congratulations and best wishes.
All righty. Well, with that, I am going to now introduce our moderator. Elisa Ramirez is Deputy Chief of Staff for Representative Tom Malinowski of New Jersey. Elisa is also the Vice President of the CHLI Alumni Association. She was an intern in Washington, D.C. in 2012, originally from Southern California, and since then has been in public service, supporting members of Congress in Washington, D.C. And so she is going to lead this conversation, introduce all our panelists. Elisa, the floor is yours, dear.
Thank you, Marianne. Thank you, CHLI. Very excited to be here and start this conversation. What I would like to do is do brief introductions for each panelist, and all of our panelists are just incredibly successful experts on this issue. So, but for the first speaker, so Dr. Dara Richardson Herron, she's a physician by training and an advocate by choice. Dr. Richardson Herron has 25 plus years, a career has spanned academic, government, for-profit, and nonprofit sectors. Now, as Pfizer's Chief Patient Officer, she leads the company's work to advance patient-focused programs and platforms with the goal of better responding to patients' and communities' needs and reducing health disparities. Our next panelist, Dr. Michael Ibarra. He's a board-certified emergency physician and vice president and chief of medical affairs at Pharma. In his capacity at Pharma, Dr. Ibarra leads stakeholder outreach on federal and international health policy issues and Pharma's internal and external medical affairs engagement. And moving right along, Dr. Elena Rios, she's the president and CEO of the National Hispanic Medical Association and president of the National Hispanic Health Foundation. She currently serves on a myriad of board of directors, which includes Care First, Blue Cross Blue Shield, and the National Hispanic Leadership Agenda. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Jewel Mullen. She hails from the University of Texas at Austin's Dell Medical School, where she is the Associate Dean for Health Equity, as well as an Associate Professor in the school's Population Health and Internal Medicine departments. And now let's dive right in. So the question that I think all of us we want to get right to it, and that is, because it's on everyone's mind right now, when will there be a vaccine and will it be safe? And this question I pose to all of you, and specifically for those that work for member companies, so Pharma and Pfizer, but what steps have these companies, what are they taking to ensure that the vaccine will be safe?
So I will start. Certainly safety was, is, and always be our #1 priority in vaccine research and development at Pfizer. In terms of the when, as I mentioned earlier, there are regulatory hurdles that we must overcome in order to make sure that our vaccine is safe and effective. I direct you to our website. It's Pfizer.com. Our CEO put out a wonderful letter that just kind of really outlines the steps that have to happen in order for us to release our vaccine. But certainly, I just want to be clear that safe and effective vaccines for us are the key to defeating this pandemic and helping to provide real protection from the disease. We started our clinical early trial in a measured and deliberate way with patient safety at the forefront. And we actually selected the vaccine candidate that we wanted to move forward with using stringent safety and tolerability criteria. As I mentioned before, Pfizer has been in the vaccine development business for well over 100 years. And even though we're moving at extraordinary speed, preservation of high quality and safety standards is critical. As I mentioned, we're planning to enroll up to 44,000 subjects. Half of them will receive the active vaccine, and this constitutes a large safety database consistent with other large vaccine efficacy trials. And for the COVID study, as with all of our trials, researchers are required to follow very strict rules to make sure that participants are safe. And just as an example, the trial protocols are reviewed by regulatory authorities and approved by institutional review boards. And that's an independent committee that reviews the methods that are proposed for the research. But in addition, the trial's progress is closely monitored by both Pfizer and an external group of independent experts called a Data and Safety Monitoring Committee. And trial investigators are responsible for monitoring participants' health, and participants in the trial have regular planned follow-up visits as part of the trial. And, a related question I get a lot is how are we able to move so quickly? And again, we're accelerating the development process by doing some of the steps in parallel rather than sequentially. So, it's very, very important for us to make it clear that safety is job one, effectiveness is job one for us. And in the usual drug development journey, the process of preparing regulatory data packages to submit to the FDA and waiting for its response often takes months. But in the fight against COVID around the globe, regulators are responding to this data much more quickly, often in real time, to help keep trials running as quickly as possible. So while we're moving quickly, I want to reinforce that Pfizer has a long history, and we're going to honor our legacy of discovering and manufacturing high quality medicines, and we would never cut corners.
Those are really, really great comments, Dr. Richardson-Heron. Thank you for having me on the panel, Marianne and Eliza. Thanks for moderating. I just want to jump in and echo a couple of points, which I completely agree with. PhRMA is the trade association, and we represent a variety of manufacturers, and we're really proud of our membership, including Pfizer, which is leading the development of a vaccine candidate. And I just want to echo that companies are doing everything possible to bring a vaccine to market as quickly, but also as safely as possible. And I think one point that I want to further emphasize is the fact that no steps are being skipped. Instead, steps are happening in some cases, in parallel as opposed to strictly in series. And manufacturing is a great example of that, where some companies are choosing now to manufacture at risk so that we're ready in the case that one of these vaccines is approved. And it is a really incredible effort that builds on many decades of scientific expertise and knowledge about the human genome and about genomes in general, and mRNA and RNA. All of that knowledge contributed to the quick response. And one of the things that we talk about from the pharma perspective is having multiple shots on goal, meaning multiple vaccine candidates that look at this from a variety of different approaches. Pfizer, Moderna, those companies are looking at mRNA technology, but there are other approaches that are being looked at. AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson are looking at adenovirus vectors. They are in phase 3 clinical trials, although both of those trials are currently paused in the US. And that should be reassuring to folks that the system is working appropriately to take into account all of the safety mechanisms that were just put forward. So I just want to echo all the comments that were just made. And it's a tremendous race. Companies are working in collaboration right now in ways that they hadn't before. It's a really impressive time. Incredibly challenging time, but I do think that the collaboration and the partnerships are things that will carry forward.
And Dr. Ibarra, as I understand it, you also are participating in a vaccine clinical trial. Why is it important for you to do that? Why is it important for you to make sure there's broad representation within clinical trials?
Yeah, so I'm one of the people enrolled in a clinical trial. I'm actually in the Moderna trial. I signed up at coronaviruspreventionnetwork.org, which everyone can go to. It's the NIH website that kind of takes a lot of information from people around the country that are interested in participating, and then they share that information with the clinical trial sponsors. And I just happened to be outreached by Moderna, although this week I got a call from a different company seeing if I would be interested, or a different clinical trial site to see if I'd be interested interested in participating, but of course I'm already in one. And it's been an amazing experience. I will say that one of the reasons that I was interested in doing this is because I, like many of you, are interested in ending this pandemic as quickly as possible. And by participating in a clinical trial, that certainly speeds the process along, because you need to fully enroll a trial before you can see the data and report those out to the FDA. And a safe and effective vaccine is likely the most important step to getting to that herd immunity that we need for this to be over. And I really am glad that I participated. I've already gotten the two shots, the two vaccines, or placebo. I don't know which one. I had my first subsequent follow-up, I guess my 2-month visit just this Tuesday, actually, where I had blood drawn and just to check in. I've been doing really well on the trial, and it's provided me a lot of perspective. When I first finished residency, I was very uncomfortable taking care of babies, of kids. I'm an emergency physician, and it wasn't until I had my own babies that I really understood what it was like to be a parent in the emergency room. And I think for me, working on policy issues around clinical trials and drug development, this is going to provide me a lot of important perspective moving forward. So it's been a great experience thus far, and I'm hopeful that it speeds the process along as much as possible.
Well, thank you. And so we can stay on clinical trials, Dr. Richardson-Heron, if you can tell us why it's so important to have diversity in clinical trials.
I can't say enough about the importance of diversity in clinical trials. I spent, 3 years at the National Institutes of Health at the All of Us research program creating a diverse database. But, there are many studies that show that race, environment, ethnicity, culture, age, and gender are all factors that may impact patient outcomes. But historically, many groups have not been fully represented in clinical trials for many different reasons. And some of them are, unfortunately, due to some of the historic transgressions and research that has been done that really, unfortunately, did not leave people feeling very good about our healthcare system. But here's the point. Latinx populations comprise about 19% of the US population, but make up only about 1% of clinical trial participants. And similarly, African Americans account for roughly 13% of the United States population, but make up only about 5% of clinical trial participants. And so this underrepresentation makes it much more difficult for researchers, regulatory, and physicians to understand the extent to which a medicine can help subsets of a population at large. So, I always say, if you're not part of the research, you may be left out of the cure. So one of the main reasons it's important to be involved in clinical trials is to make sure that you, your family, and your community can benefit from the advances.
Thank you. And for building off of the importance of diversity in this aspect, but in what ways might the committee's use of the CDC's Social Vulnerability Index help address dramatic COVID-19 associated disparities in Hispanic communities? And if you could also explain to our viewers what this index, the function of the index is.
Thank you. And so I'm going to start at first, before I even start answering your question. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here with you all. Thank you. Thank you. And to represent the work that our study committee for the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine conducted. I wanted to start the answer by going back to when will there be a vaccine and will it be safe? Because that very question also gets into the response I'm going to give you around social vulnerability, et cetera. And here's why I want to start there. Sometimes behind the question, when will there'll be a vaccine, is the question, when will there be one for me? And in the same way in which we're emphasizing how important it is to participate in trials, we also want to be sure that everyone can trust the vaccine is going to be safe and available for them. And yet, even with all of the excellence in science and the caution that unfolds, there won't be enough vaccine for everyone right away, which means that answer to when will there be one isn't necessarily there will be one for you right away. And that was the perspective with which our committee was actually convened by the CDC and the NIH to say, so then what do we do to really assure two things, equity and ethics inform those decisions about phases for who will get the vaccine most immediately. And so getting to social vulnerability and how that relates to this entire conversation, what I want to say is, just in the way that Dr. Richardson has already acknowledged, we are very aware of the disparities among Hispanic, African American, Native American, Asian and Pacific Islander, and other populations. But as our committee did the work, we didn't focus just on if you fall into a specific racial category, you rise into the first phase automatically, because we also understand a lot of what goes along with the racial and ethnic characteristics is the social context, income, neighborhood, whether or not you live in crowded conditions, access to transportation. And that's what rolls into the social vulnerability index, the kind of work people do. I remember seeing people holding signs, "I am not my underlying conditions." I would also say on behalf of people, "I am not my social determinants of health." However, we had to acknowledge that people don't have control over the circumstances that have made the risks higher for them. So for every phase, which I won't go into detail right now, in which we have said we'll take honoring that everyone is equal. Nobody is more important than anyone else. We want to mitigate or reduce those health inequities, and we want to provide as much benefit to society as possible from a health standpoint and from a social and economic standpoint, no matter whether or not you are a healthcare worker, whether or not you're a teacher, whether or not you're a healthy college student, et cetera. Those social factors, those social vulnerabilities put you even more at risk. And therefore, for every phase, we've encouraged state, territorial, tribal, and local health officials not to just look at people in those specific ethnic and racial categories, but to say, what else makes them a setup for excess disease and death? I know it's a long answer, but I'm passionate, and anytime I can send a message to people that the spirit of this is one of fairness, equity, and ethics, we need to get that message out.
And thank you for that. No, a very important response. How can this report support the well-being of Hispanic people and communities beyond the pandemic, though?
So my quick response to that is, after this pandemic, we should no longer have to ask ourselves, why are we seeing these disparities if we have had yet another example of the inequities responsible for them? And so this pandemic is just the most recent example of what happens when people do not have equity in education and in housing and in transportation. And I would go as far as saying, given that we have talked about the undue burden on people who perform work that is essential to everybody else's functioning and well-being, it can also be a reminder to employers that they have a role in protecting the people that still come to work every day. I don't take up all the time. And I'm looking at some of my colleagues here who might have more to say, so I'll just stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Mullen. And shifting to Dr. Rios. What is the National Hispanic Medical Association doing to educate Latinos about COVID-19?
Well, the National Hispanic Medical Association, first of all, had to cancel its annual conference, which was about a month after we were told by CDC and the White House and Washington, D.C. government, because we are in Washington, D.C., that we had to stop all groups of people coming together. So that the first thing we decided was we were going to continue our effort to educate our members and others interested in our goal of improving the health of Hispanics and other underserved by having a monthly Zoom webinar. And we had to learn Zoom right away. So starting in May, we have had monthly webinars with doctors from the front lines, and also hospital executives and nurses and mental health professionals. And I think what's important to realize that our organization, unlike a lot of Latino organizations in town, are made up of professionals who are used as our ambassadors and messengers to their patients and communities across the country. And we now have 17 chapters in major markets around the country. And what we've done is built a sense of sharing expert knowledge that's not from journals and we need more documentation, and I have to work on doing that. But we have brought together strategies and successes from hospitals and clinics and doctors' offices, pharmacies, the institutions that make up the safety net in our communities through these webinars. And I have to say Pfizer helped us with the grant, as did some other partners, but we're thankful for that. And then we decided, well, why don't we have media and social media be used as a way to increase and expand that educational effort. So we used Facebook Live, which was incredible. And we've also partnered with others. AARP, for example, wanted us to talk about the elderly, since the elderly in our communities, not only did they get the most physical problems, but the mental health isolation. And for grandparents, especially, ARP is for people that are supposedly retiring at 50. I mean, everybody lives longer now than when ARP started, but the grandparents in our families have been protected, and we wanted to address the issue of families working to do great public health activities like wearing a mask and washing your hands and all that. But everybody forgot about, well, what is that impact going to be in our families? Not coming together for birthdays and 4th of July, celebrations. So I think that was one partner. Another partner example, I got to interview Dr. Fauci for the National Association of Hispanic Publications. And these are the mom and pop, and they're probably not all mom and pop, but there are Spanish ethnic newspapers, just like the African American newspapers, Chinese and Asian newspapers. Our communities get excited about reading about their communities, and they're usually more localized. Dr. Fauci was a great role model on messages to our communities and about the importance, especially of Latinos, because they have been burdened by COVID-19 so much. And then doing a few, the All of Us research program, which Dr. Dora Richardson was part of. We started fireside chat series and actually included the concept that clinical research and clinical trials needed to be diverse, and especially to find the new vaccines for COVID-19. And then lastly, I'll say I've actually been a part of and a few board members of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services committees. One of them is just looking at ways that we can get the word out to minority communities with the Office of Minority Health. And the other one is on the vaccine consultancy on finding ways to share information about Project Warp Speed and how to get the word out. And we've been actively letting people know through our networks, newsletters, social media, et cetera, about enrolling in the clinical trial that Dr. Ibarra mentioned, the website for HHS, as well as the website for Pfizer. And when the other companies actually have their, the websites, we'll add that to the list. So I think it's been about education and informing and helping to get more of our community involved in the vaccine clinical trials, and then eventually and I'll just say one more thing. We have a flu campaign to get flu vaccines. And believe me, I mean, our communities don't get flu vaccines. So do you think they're going to get the COVID-19 vaccines? So we need to connect the dots and share how important it is to feel better by having the flu vaccine and to be protected more from getting the worst disease impact of COVID, especially for the elderly and those with chronic conditions like asthma or high blood pressure, diabetes, obesity that we have in our communities. So there's a lot that we've been trying to do.
No, thank you, Dr. Rios. If you could elaborate through the webinars, other social media platforms, what other issues has NHMA, the National Hispanic Medical Association, the doctors, part of this association, what have they found out about COVID-19 and Latinos?
Oh, it's tremendous, the impact on the Latino community. A lot of people have died within a week, within days. People didn't realize how lethal this virus is. I think that's the number one. And then you get the dynamics in our communities. Our families are so close, and you can't have funerals. You can't have, birthday celebrations, because you want to protect you want to be able to have the social distancing. So that's something that we've learned. And I think the mental health, the depression, not only that, fear, and then with all of our, on top of what's happening with the COVID and a disease, we have our immigration issues that have been really, talk about, hitting home for all these unaccompanied children that started showing up at our borders a few years ago. It's just gotten worse with all the, Latin American families trying to send young families and their children, and then being separated at the border. The doctors at the border have been volunteering because it takes too long to apply for civil service and to get a license to be able to practice on the border. So a lot of the doctors that have been volunteering with the Catholic Charities and have just seen, just horrendous situations, and have tried to do what they could to help with, especially the young kids that got real sick because they were already immunocompromised and had been traveling forever. And so I think that's something that they've learned. The other thing is, I think there's really a need for more insurance reform. We need more affordable. People talk about surprise billing, right? Surprise billing was something that we talked about before COVID in the policy arena. But here we have people getting hospitalized that don't even have insurance. There's going to be and then we have so many small businesses in our communities that are losing jobs. They had to close down, restaurants had to close, hotels had to close, whole industries with our communities involved that lost jobs, or they're essential workers and had to go to work and get sick. So it's tremendous impact on the Latino community that is not going to go away, and we're going to have to deal with policies for next year, to continue to help with affordable ways to help with health insurance, especially people that lost their jobs. Sorry. Go. Yeah.
Dr. Mullen, please.
No, go ahead.
I took notes. You can't, with the screen, I might not be able to see it, but when the National Academies held a public hearing after we released the first portion of the draft report, Dr. Rios was one of the people who spoke to us. So I just wanted to build on some of the points she didn't mention, because they were very important. They're related to what she just said. And there are also considerations that we factored in that I wanted people to hear. And so just expanding on what you said about people and their families and reminding us the importance of cultural humility in our approach is key. And in the way in which you've talked about issues at the border and this notion that we really held very, very closely around equal regard for all people, we wanted to spell out that people's so-called legal status ought not be any kind of barrier to receiving the vaccine, and that we wanted for all people there not to be any out-of-pocket costs. So those were just some of the recommendations that we made, along with really working with organizations like the NHMA and local physicians who actually are much closer to communities to build understanding, and even where trust is not an issue, to really just remind people, even if you're healthy, you could end up suffering very greatly. So I just wanted to reinforce those things because they are so critical. And I like I said, I brought my notes. So thank you.
No, this
Yeah.
this is great, and it's important to paint from everyone's perspective here a vivid reality of what we're dealing with and arguably going to deal with for some time. That's really for you all to tell us, which is why you're here. But just to Dr. Ibarra, if you can add more color to this point before we shift to COVID-19 treatment. But you wear many different hats, including one as an emergency department physician in Washington, D.C., in the Washington, D.C. area. How has COVID-19 impacted your work as a provider over these past several months?
Yeah, and I actually want to dovetail on what Dr. Rios and Mullen were just saying, because I think some of the kind of my own anecdotal experience really mirror what you all were talking about. I also really appreciated the comments, and I took I have my own mental notes. I need to go and learn more about the report that you mentioned, Dr. Mullen. So thank you for providing that insights. I love being in these forums to really learn from the experts as well as participate. I'm practicing emergency medicine at Georgetown, one of the local hospitals in DC. I've been there for almost 10 years. It's where I did my residency training, and then I stayed on the faculty before moving to pharma in 2014. And obviously I didn't go to bed on New Year's Eve 2019 going into 2020 imagining my clinical work would be shaped by a pandemic, of course. And in fact, every day I try and think back of remember when this popped in my head. And I saw a patient pretty early on in January that really kind of jump-started my sense of awareness of the pandemic. It was a returning student from China who came in with a fever. And all of a sudden I had to become an expert on coronavirus, on COVID-19, and figure out how to kind of diagnose, treat, take care of. It was a really intense experience because it was late at night. I only work swing shifts because I work at pharma during the day, and I was working 3 to midnight. And I remember seeing this person at the end of my shift and being on the phone for hours, because at that time we were still couriering our tests to the CDC in Atlanta. And, I had to talk to a million different folks on the phone call from Department of Health and Infectious Disease. And, that was my jump start into my knowledge of COVID-19. We all had that moment where we kind of had to become, really much more knowledgeable than we were the second before. And that was crystallizing for me. That was really early on in January. So fast track to now, the last, few months have clearly been shaped by COVID-19. There were times where I was working in the emergency department and all we were doing was what we called COVID care, because everyone coming in was either being evaluated for COVID or had it, they needed a test, or they were really sick with it. So now things have definitely gotten better where I work locally. We're seeing kind of more of the general mix, but for a while there, it was really all kind of COVID and COVID related care. And that meant people were putting off the other things. Like, I don't imagine that the heart attacks, strokes, the normal kind of bread and butter emergency medicine went away. I don't know what happened. I think those people unfortunately stayed home, and I worried a lot about, where all those patients were since they weren't in the emergency department when I was working. But I guess to tie it back to where I started and where Dr. Mullen and Rios were, what really jumped out anecdotally for me were all of the things you were just saying. I mean, the patients that we were seeing coming in with COVID, it was disproportionately Latino populations, members, of the Black community in DC. I know it's impacted Native Americans. We don't have a large Native American community in the DC area, so it was largely Latinx and Black communities that were coming into the emergency department. And the trends match what the data shows now. What I was seeing clearly matched. I mean, it was people that were working in those, essential worker type jobs, that they were dependent on public transportation to get to and from work. They were living in multi-generation housing. They had significant comorbid conditions. So So while, my clinical work was clearly to learn how to care for COVID-19, very quickly, I saw a lot of these things kind of firsthand, and I think the data clearly backs it up, but my own anecdotes really kind of, really showed it to be true.
Thank you. And so I would like to shift to the different treatments that are being circulated right now. And this question is for Dr. Ibarra and Dr. Richardson-Heron. And so over the last 2 weeks, Americans have heard a lot about treatments for patients with COVID. Can you describe the various approaches that the industry is investigating to treat COVID-19?
Sure. I'm happy to jump off, and I can turn it over to Dr. Richardson if you want to talk about the Pfizer approach. I think what, the way I've kind of broken it down is into a few big buckets. You've got antivirals. I think one thing kind of really important to know early on is that this virus has two phases. It's got the viral phase where it's the actual coronavirus, the COVID-19, the SARS-CoV-2 that's causing the direct damage to the body. And then you've got that kind of later phase where the viral load may have diminished, but the immune system is still active. And there's the thought that the immune system is creating this collateral damage to the body that's leading to issues that patients are facing. So you kind of treat each phase a little bit different. And clearly this is a very evolving standard of care. We treat patients very differently today than we did 3 months ago, and we're going to treat them differently probably 3 months from now than we're doing today. So this is a kind of snapshot of what we think today is the best approach. And I think it is working because we're seeing diminishing mortality rates, people staying in the hospital, and to a large extent, that's due to innovation in the medicine front. So we have antivirals like remdesivir, other medicines being investigated that are directly attack the virus. You've got anti-inflammatory medicines that suppress that later immune reaction, like dexamethasone is one that is being used. And then you have antibodies that are being looked at. None of them are currently approved, but those are basically immune systems in a bottle that you can get people that have recovered from COVID, isolate the antibodies, and then mass produce them so that people can have that protection early on. And I think we're going to hear more about that in the coming weeks because they are being looked at by the FDA. And then there's all sorts of other medicines that are being repurposed, anticoagulants, antimicrobials, that are being looked at as potential kind of adjunctive therapies that are showing to have an impact. So there's a ton of innovation going on. Some are repurposed therapies that have been on the market before. Others are new medicines that are being invented right now or being studied right now and had not had a previous purpose until COVID-19. So there's a lot happening, and we are making tremendous progress.
Yeah, and I'll just add, at Pfizer, we're actively scaling up our manufacturing capacity and distribution infrastructure to be ready to bring forth a vaccine candidate. That's what we're focused on. Of course, our development teams are working on many other things, but we really are focused on the vaccine candidate with the goal of bringing it to the world faster, but of course, as safe as possible. And our track record gives us confidence in our ability to do that. And certainly that's what we're focusing in. In fact, we think that with the combination of our manufacturing facilities network along with BioNTech, we believe that we have the capacity to produce approximately 100 million doses by the end of 2020 and greater than 1 billion doses by the end of 2021, of course, subject to regulatory authorization or approval. So that's really what we're working on. That's our biggest effort at this point, and we're really hoping to have success in that effort.
And actually, Dr. Richardson-Heron, if we can dive into that, because I wanted to shift on Pfizer's efforts regarding manufacturing and distribution, that perspective. But if you can flesh that out for us, because we're curious to know what Pfizer is doing currently, because sure, you can have a vaccine, but then you need to distribute it and to do it in a efficient and responsible way.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, we're hoping to produce 100 million doses by the end of 2020 and more than 1 billion by 2021. And we have contracts currently in place with several governments to supply our vaccine candidate if and when it receives regulatory authorization or approval. We also seek to work with governments to support distribution to priority groups that have been mentioned, that each government identifies, and we anticipate that points of vaccination will vary, but will include hospitals, outpatient clinics. But from a logistics perspective, we're working hard to develop a plan that will make sure that we can distribute the vaccine equitably and safely to those who need it. But keeping in mind that governments are making the decisions, and we hope that they are following the rubric and the guidelines that Dr. Mullen and her team have put forth, because we support those as well.
Thank you. And this question is directed also to you, Dr. Richardson-Heron, and that is, if you can talk to us about how Pfizer's helping address advanced vaccine confidence, and if you could also explain to our viewers what that means.
So let me first start with the challenge. There is clear mistrust of the healthcare system in many communities of color. But it's really important to make it clear that this mistrust has been well earned. We have to come to terms with the reality that the healthcare system and researchers of the past have not always been kind to Latinx or other underserved communities. In fact, many communities of color have little or no trust whatsoever in the health care system due to historic transgressions where people of color were not treated with respect, and in some cases they were even harmed. I mean, we've heard of the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force Tuskegee syphilis study, the unauthorized use of Henrietta Lacks cancer cells, a Guatemala syphilis experience, a Havasupai tribe experience. Unfortunately, the list goes on and on, but moreover, some communities of color, as has been described before, continue to face barriers to accessing health services, including institutional and systemic racism, implicit bias, and microaggressions. And so all of these things have left a long-lasting legacy affecting the willingness of some people of color to participate in potentially life-saving research, to take life-saving medications, or to receive vaccinations. They just don't feel that they may be safe. And as was mentioned, vaccine hesitancy didn't start with the COVID-19 vaccine candidate. I think a couple of our other panelists mentioned that very few people even get the flu shot. I mean, for example, 45% of Americans did not receive the flu vaccine in 2018 and 2019. No, I'm sorry, 45% did. Only 45% did receive it. And that number is even smaller when you look at adults of color. About 37% of Hispanic Americans received the vaccine in the 2018-2019 flu season. So all of the unfortunate past transgressions and mistrust of the health care system has led to, unfortunately, people not being confident in medications and some treatments. But we want to make sure that people understand the importance of getting vaccinated. We want people to understand that connection between vaccinations and health, medications. I mean, all of these things are very important. So we have to make that value proposition to individuals so that they understand the value of participation in clinical trials and how that makes them, communities have a better chance of benefiting from the results. So the hesitancy is unfortunately, due to past transgressions, but I think all of us have a responsibility to help people understand the value proposition. I think that's on us to make it clear how participation in clinical trials and receiving a vaccine, once proven and safe and effective, can help reduce some of the health disparities that we're seeing.
Certainly. And for the viewers, this is going to be my last question. So if you do have questions, please put it in the chat. And I know that CHLI staff will also I put that in the chat as well. If you could just please, when you type your question out, if it's directed to a certain panelist, great. If it's for everyone, just make note of that. And then my last question would be, and again, this would be for Dr. Richardson-Heron, because we did talk about clinical trials in the beginning, but I know that you're doing very interesting, important work with making sure that enrolling Latinx populations in its COVID-19 clinical trials. But if you can talk to us about those efforts.
Yeah, well, as we've talked about earlier, the pandemic has drawn focus to the need for greater racial and ethnic diversity in clinical trials. It's not a new issue. Diverse communities have long been underrepresented in clinical research. But as everyone has said, COVID has shown a necessary spotlight on work we have to do once again. So with our vaccine trial, we've made it a priority to enroll a diverse population, one that reflects the diversity of the world we live in and is inclusive of communities that have been disproportionately affected by COVID, like the Hispanic and Latinx community. We know that Hispanics and Latinos are among those who've seen higher rates of COVID, as been mentioned. And so, it's absolutely critical that these populations are represented as potential interventions are being evaluated. So, we've taken active steps to engage the Latinx community. As Dr. Rios mentioned, we've been partnering with her organization and other similar organizations. We've conducted studies in locations with diverse communities and have selected the investigator sites that have been most impacted. And we also had sites in Argentina and Brazil, in US sites in locations like Arizona, Florida, New York, and Texas, all states with large numbers of Latinos. We're working with these sites also on a one-on-one basis to better understand and enhance their efforts to develop culturally sensitive, respectful, and bidirectional activities that will further engage individuals and break down the barriers that are unique sometimes to the underrepresented communities in their area. Things like transportation, it might sound simple, but your childcare, having sites that are open at different hours so that people can get to the sites. Partnering though with trusted grassroots organization like Dr. Rios' organization, the Hispanic Federation, Dia de la Mujer, Artina, to raise awareness, it has been so important. And we too have been involved in putting advertorials in some of the newspapers that Dr. Rios mentioned. The National Newspaper Publishers Association and the National Association of Hispanic Publishers, to ensure that communities have the information that they need. And one last thing, we're working to reduce barriers to enrollment, like language, by translating some of the materials where necessary. So there's a lot of things that we've done. I urge those who are interested to check out by searching Undoing Underrepresentation on YouTube, and you'll see our public service announcements, both in English and in Spanish. And that really are helping us get the word out about the importance of our vaccine to all communities, in particular the Latinx community.
Thank you. And before we go into the Q&A, if all of you, and starting with Dr. Rios, if you can mention just a few comments that perhaps weren't addressed and you would like to address them now.
Well, I think other things that we have done that I think more of CHLI's ambassadors, your board members, your leaders across the country, your alumni. I was asked to do an interview. I think we need to be out there doing more interviews in our communities, whether it's newspaper, social media. There's all kinds of social media influencers now with their own groups. But we need to say the same thing, that we need to protect our families from COVID-19 by helping to do whatever our public health and science leaders tell us to do. And the wearing the mask, washing hands, cleaning our surfaces, social distancing. I think we're going to live like this all next year till we have enough people getting the vaccine. And then the other message is to get enrolled in clinical trials if you can. But more importantly, I think, is when we have a safe and effective vaccine, no matter who the company is that makes it, and if we have 2 or 3 vaccines, even better, that we actually encourage our families to get it. And just one last word. I was really happy to be asked to do an interview with one of our young Latina performers named Becky G. And I thought, oh my goodness, how am I going to talk to a millennial? But I mean, we have to, I have a young niece who was living with me the last couple of years, and she's here in DC, and it's like, my God, I feel so I feel so old, but we we really do need to have everybody at all ages talk this up. This is really, really history in the making, and we need to be positive and do what we can, and you know, be proactive.
Dr. Ibarra, if you would like to go next.
Sure. Well, I started by talking about the collaboration that's occurring across industry, companies working together on things like manufacturing and collaboration, and in the development of therapeutics and vaccines. But I think that expertise and collaboration also extends beyond that. And you know, one of the good examples, I think it might have been Pfizer CEO said, we're not in a competition against each other. We're in a competition against the vaccine, or I'm sorry, against the virus. You know, the virus is ultimately the enemy.
Yes. Not the vaccine, the virus.
Against the virus. And so it's really all hands on deck effort to beat the virus, and that extends to things like development of laboratory tests, donation of PPE, donation of medical supplies. I think we touched a little bit on ensuring supply chain and avoiding drug shortages, but there's been a tremendous amount of work that's occurred across industry. So I know the focus was on therapeutics and vaccine and beating the virus, but there is a lot of other work that's happening across the industry to ensure that that all of those other things can be can be addressed. So collaboration is a really important theme for our industry.
Dr. Mullen.
So agreeing with all the previous comments, I want to observe that this is one of those, what I would call not top down, but top out discussions. And I encourage that we do more so-called bottom, starting with what I'll call the real people, not that my colleagues and I aren't, bottom out instead, because fundamentally for everything that we know and do from where we sit in our day jobs and in our hearts as advocates, a lot of what moves people to do things is going to be influenced by what happens in their everyday lives and the conversations that they have with their friends, their families, and trusted messengers, including young people who are trusted messengers. I feel old sometimes too, Dr. Rios. So that to me is so fundamental, because there are so many other layers of detail that we can't cover here. So whether we talk about one vaccine or multiple vaccines, for example, what the science will tell us is which groups actually benefit best from them. Because it may be that there's a vaccine that we say, oh, but really it's more effective in this group more so than that group, age-wise, or maybe there's a reason someone else can't take it. So the more in which we also continue to work with our community health workers and our local clinicians, people who run community organizations, to treat them as our partners in science, public health, and ethics, the better. Because that notion of don't take my word for it sometimes needs to apply here, as long as I can give somebody else the information. And I would say, given that what we've talked about with regard to vaccine acceptance and health promotion and risk communication, we've made some very specific recommendations in the report, which I won't outline here, but a lot of those recommendations also are what I would call not just the bottom out ones, but they are also let the messages be created by the folks who most and best communicate with the recipients of those messages. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. And Dr. Richardson, Heron.
Well, certainly I believe fully that the message and the messenger matter. And I also just want to say that, I echo the comments of my panelists. We have a lot of work to do in our communities, in particular, to build trust. And we recognize that it won't happen overnight. But I think it's a responsibility for all of us to make the value proposition clear, to really share how important it is for people to participate in clinical trials, to receive a vaccine once proven and safe, to help reduce health disparities. And although at Pfizer, we can't predict exactly when or even if our vaccine will be approved by the FDA for distribution to the public, but we do know that the world will be much safer if we stop talking about the vaccines delivery in political terms and focus instead on a rigorous, independent scientific evaluation and a robust independent approval process that takes into account the needs of the people who we're trying to serve, both culturally and their medical needs. I think that should be our focus so that we can all get back to our lives and live healthy and productive lives.
Thank you, everyone. And let's get to it. The first question, and it's actually for you, Dr. Richardson-Heron. So Jasmine, they would like to know what efforts are being made to guarantee equal access of treatment, experimental medication, or treatments and vaccines to the biggest Hispanic territory of the United States, Puerto Rico.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, really governments are making the decisions where the vaccine is going to go. Certainly at Pfizer, we want to make sure that everyone has access to the vaccine, and we want it to be equitable. But the current governments are the ones that are going to be making these decisions, there are guidelines that groups like, Dr. Mullen's group is working on, but as for our part, governments are the ones that are making these decisions. And all of our current agreements are with governments, and they will prioritize access to the potential vaccine if it's ultimately approved.
Thank you. Oh, and
I can add to that.
Jump right in.
Okay, so our national public health leader, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, is the coordinator of vaccine distribution across the states, the tribes, the territories, and the local governments. Working with states and honoring the explicit authority of tribal nations, CDC will allocate at first based on population size. As of last week, every jurisdiction was asked to submit a plan to the federal government to demonstrate how they plan within their own state or territory to distribute. But because we understand that there can still be undue burden or more inequity in certain areas, what we recommended is that for the national vaccine supply, 10% be held back so that if there are communities, jurisdictions, or larger population groups who are experiencing either a worse expression of the pandemic at one point or undue burden anyway, say with social vulnerability, that extra vaccine could be sent to them. And so that would be the kind of framework that could also and should guide distribution to Puerto Rico.
Thank you. And if anybody else would like to chime in before I move on to the next question, feel free to speak up. Okay. So the next question, this is from Roy Cosme, and they would like to know, what are the policy implications with regards to the recommendations and framework posed by the NASEM, the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, the committee? And are there any implications for state and local governments, or are they primarily federal policy considerations?
So the recommendations were sought by both Dr. Richardson's former agency, the NIH, and the CDC together to add to any decision-making that regulatory bodies would normally undertake based on the science, to really make sure ethics and equity are fundamental to what happens. So they're recommendations, they're not laws, they're not mandates. They are the guidance that we will hope that people aspire to. And in that regard, for some people, they're probably logical. And for others, perhaps there's something else to point to for someone who might want to uphold equity and needs to say, don't just take my word for it. Look at what the government has invested in to say to the public, we're trying to actually make sure there is fairness and there is a social justice approach to this, but they're recommendations. And the body that makes the specific recommendations for any individual vaccine is also, that's the Advisory Committee for Immunization Practices, has stated that they will also factor these kinds of recommendations in.
Thank you, Dr. Mullen. All right, our next question is for Dr. Rios. They would like to know, do you think, so they first start off saying thank you for your comments about reaching out to other members of the Hispanic community, especially through social media influencers. Do you think we should especially lean into targeting the original influencers, moms and abuelas, who usually encourage action by all members of the family, and how do we do so?
You know, when I grew up, everybody had a book from the Red Cross about how to take care of things in the house, family members in the house or household that had to do with safety. You know, broken bone, a cut, just health and safety, because, you know, people don't have money to go to a doctor or go to an emergency room just for something that's minor, that especially our mothers pass on from our grandmothers how to take care of simple things, a burn, you know, a mosquito bite, those kinds. Well, we have to look at this as part of our routine of daily lives. And I think what we really need is an understanding that community health or public health is so important, and living more healthier with the types of diets and cooking and getting physical exercise and just being all around more healthy, and not having the high blood pressure and the obesity and all the problems that we have. And I know we can't get rid of all the asthma with climate change and air quality, but I do think that we have to take this as a individual responsibility and family responsibility to start talking about what it means to be healthy. And I think the government's role is really to build up our public health infrastructure. And also back in the 60s and 70s, we had public health clinics and delivery system, not just now. Public health systems are just data collection from doctors about tuberculosis or some other infectious disease like this virus. And our public health system doesn't connect to our daily lives. And we have to realize that that's what it was for. It was started by nurses to get people to drink, to boil their water, you know, in the 1900s. And anyway, so I hope that answered the question, but I think that we just have to become better citizens that are healthy too. And health is a right. And of course, we need to be able to pay for our health care. And that's where insurance reform will continue to be done in this country, and hopefully have more Medicaid and more clinics and more insurance companies giving you know, the free testing and, you know, all the things that have happened, because this has been an emergency year for healthcare. Telemedicine is another big thing, and monitoring from doctor's offices to the home and home care. All of this now is going to become part of the future of our ability to live healthier lives.
Thank you, Dr. Rios. And we do have a hard stop at 5:30, so I'm sorry to those that have posed questions in the Q&A chat. Sorry that we weren't able to get to your questions. I want to thank all of the panelists for your time. I very much enjoyed listening to all your answers, and thank you all for your efforts during these interesting and trying times. It's been quite the roller coaster. So thank you for such an insightful conversation. And with that, Marianne Gomez, I will kick it off to you to close us out.
All righty. Well, thanks again, everyone. Thank you, Elisa. Very much appreciate you moderating. If we were all together, we would be, all clapping and we would be all hugging and kissing and all of that good stuff. But obviously, we can't do that. But thank you again, all of you. Dr. Ibarra, the best of luck. Thank you very much for being part of the clinical trials. To all of you, thank you very much for what you're doing, for using your voice, for using your profession and your leadership also in the community and in the organizations that you represent. Please count on CHLI to continue the messages. We're here to be of service as well. Please let us know how we can share the information as you get that. So that we can share it with everyone who was here today. A special thank you as well to Congresswoman Jennifer Gonzalez Colon and Congresswoman Donna Shalala. And I want to end with this for everyone, more so for our participants and the attendees here than the panelists, as it was mentioned before. These are discussions that we've kind of coined as conversations, public policy conversations that are on the Hill. But not everybody is in Washington. Not everybody can be part of these conversations. Not everybody knows all the time about these conversations. So my challenge at the end of these conversations is always to those who were in this room, it is our collective responsibility now to go and tell others, to go and tell our abuelitas, to tell our neighbors, to wherever you happen to live, to use your social media platforms. If you're an influencer, we want you to do that too. We need to take action. And one way that we can individually make a difference and help others is by us individually sharing that information with others, letting them know about all these different organizations, their websites, and how we can engage the importance of women, of men of color in the community, also of different ages, to really get involved in these clinical trials, to learn about it, even if they don't want to participate, to at least share with others the safety and the importance. So again, with that, I challenge all of us to use our voice and be advocates in this time. We all need to help each other. God bless. Hope all is well with everyone, that you stay safe and healthy, and that you take care of your family and your neighbors and your loved ones. Thank you again. We appreciate your time. Last announcement is that our internship program is open right now for the spring program. Please go to our website at chli.org to find out about that and other programs that are coming up. Thank you again. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marianne.
Yeah, thanks, Marianne.
Thank you all.
Thanks.